The air conditioner died on a Tuesday afternoon, right as the heat index hit 105 degrees. 3 hours later, the compressor in the refrigerator gave its final, rattling gasp, leaving $400 worth of groceries to rot in the stagnant humidity. My husband Greg had been gone for exactly 6 days. He didn't just leave, he performed an exit. He'd packed his bags with a smirk, convinced that without his superior mechanical knowledge, I would fold within the week. He wanted me to be a broken, delicate woman living in a decaying house, forced to call him in tears to beg for a lawnmower repair or a filtered water light reset. "You can't maintain this place, Elena," he'd sneered as he loaded his trunk. "This house is a beast. You're too fragile to handle the upkeep. Just admit you're a failure and sell it so I can get my half." He was already telling his dusty little circles, the sycophants at the bar who bought into his mental health crisis act, that I was the villain. He was waiting for the house to swallow me whole. He sat in his temporary apartment, phone in hand, waiting for the "I need you" text that he believed would validate his 12 years of narcissistic entitlement. But I didn't cry over the lukewarm milk. I didn't call him when the house hit 90 degrees. Instead, I sat in the silent, sweltering foyer and opened my laptop. I wasn't looking for a repairman. I was looking for a replacement. I didn't need Greg's help. I needed his replacement cost. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from 12 years of managing a man's potential. For over a decade, I had treated Greg like a fragile glass sculpture. Whenever he stumbled, I was the cushion. Whenever he failed to hold down a job or accidentally ended up in another woman's bed, I allowed him to hide behind the shield of a mental health crisis. I was patient because I thought patience was the price of a long-term partnership. But as I sat in that sweltering kitchen, watching the ice in the freezer melt into a puddle on the hardwood, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a snap. It was a deliberate, quiet closing of a door. I realized that my patience hadn't been a virtue. It had been an interest-free loan that Greg had no intention of ever paying back. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a shock absorber. He wanted someone to pay the mortgage, manage the property, and provide the social cover while he explored every impulse he had. The heat in the house was oppressive, but for the first time in years, I felt a strange internal coolness. I looked at the dark screen of the refrigerator. In Greg's mind, that broken appliance was a symbol of my helplessness. To him, the house was a weapon he could use to starve me into submission. He wanted me to feel the weight of every square foot, every shingle, and every blade of grass until I broke. He miscalculated the source of my strength. I wasn't delicate. I was just tired of being the only adult in the room. I didn't reach for my phone to call him. I reached for my iPad and pulled up the specs for an industrial-grade sub-zero unit and a 5-ton HVAC system with a 10-year warranted parts labor agreement. In my marriage, I had been a justifier. I spent my days translating Greg's laziness into burnout and his cruelty into unprocessed trauma. But standing in that 95-degree living room, the translation services were officially terminated. I didn't need to understand Greg anymore. I needed to outcalculate him. I stopped thinking about the we that never really existed and started thinking about the estate that was currently under my feet. I didn't feel pissed off. I felt clinical. Greg had left me with a beast of a house, expecting it to devour me. He didn't realize that I was the one who had been feeding the beast all along. To understand why Greg thought I was delicate, you have to understand the dynamic of the last 12 years. I was the silent engine of a life he took credit for. I am a senior actuary for a major insurance firm. My entire life is built on predicting risk, managing loss, and ensuring the solvency of large-scale systems. When I met Greg, I applied those same skills to him. He was charming, creative, and tortured. The classic trifecta that convinces a capable woman she can be the one to finally ground a drifting soul. For over a decade, I carried the financial, emotional, and operational load of our marriage. I paid for the $1.2 million estate we lived in. I paid for the 2 SUVs in the driveway. I even paid for his entrepreneurial ventures, 3 different boutique consulting firms that failed not because of the market, but because Greg preferred the lifestyle of a CEO to the actual work of one. Every time one of his businesses folded, or every time I found a suspicious string of messages on his phone, he had a prepackaged excuse ready. "I'm just in a dark place, Elena," he'd say, staring blankly at the wall with a practiced, hollow gaze. "My depression is reaching a peak. I don't know why I do these things. I'm just trying to feel something." I believed him because I wanted to. I treated his mental health crises as legitimate medical emergencies. I paid for the high-end therapists he only visited twice. I paid for the wellness retreats in Sedona that turned out to be glorified drinking benders with his dusty friends. I was so busy being his caregiver that I didn't realize I was actually his benefactor. The infidelity wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. The first time happened in year 3. A co-worker at his short-lived marketing gig. He cried. He blamed his childhood. He promised to change. I justified it as a lapse in judgment caused by his instability. The second time was year 7. A friend from the gym. This time he didn't even apologize. He told me that my perfectionism made him feel small, and he needed someone who didn't judge him for his struggles. I responded by working harder, being more patient, and providing even more financial cushioning, hoping that if I removed all his external stressors, he would finally be well. By year 10, the pattern had evolved into a lifestyle. Greg had become a professional victim. He realized that as long as he claimed to be struggling, I would keep the lights on and the fridge stocked. He spent his days at the local bar or the country club, telling anyone who would listen that his corporate high-strung wife didn't understand his artistic soul. He was using my $250,000 salary to fund the very life that allowed him to denigrate me. The financial disparity was staggering. Over 12 years, I had contributed exactly 92% of our total household income. I had tracked every penny in a spreadsheet Greg never knew existed. $640,000 in mortgage payments and property taxes. $115,000 in startup capital for his failed businesses. $85,000 in wellness and medical expenses for his crises. $140,000 in travel and lifestyle maintenance. He thought he was a partner. In reality, he was a line item. The most offensive part of the backstory, however, was the infidelity clause. In year 5, after his second affair, I had insisted we sign a postnuptial agreement. I told him it was for my peace of mind, to help me rebuild trust. Greg, in his typical arrogance, barely read it. He saw it as a gesture to keep the gravy train running. The clause was simple. In the event of documented physical or emotional infidelity, the offending party forfeits all claims to the equity of the primary residence and any secondary real estate holdings, and is entitled to no more than 30% of joint liquid assets. He signed it while eating a sandwich I had made for him, in a house I had paid for. He thought he was humoring his sensitive wife. He didn't realize he was signing his own financial death warrant. He spent the last 12 years mistaking my silence for ignorance and my patience for weakness. He thought because I didn't scream, I didn't see. He thought because I kept the grass green and the bills paid, I was delicate and traditional. He didn't realize that I wasn't being traditional. I was being tactical. I was waiting for the moment when the Mental Health Crisis Act would finally run out of steam, and he would show his true face. When he finally walked out, laughing about the broken air conditioner and the beast of a house, he thought he was leaving a victim behind. He didn't know he was leaving an auditor who had been waiting 7 years to collect on a debt. The most effective cage is the one you don't realize you're in. Greg didn't use iron bars. He used a psychological tactic known as intermittent reinforcement and weaponized incompetence. He spent 12 years training me to believe that without my constant vigilance, his entire world, and by extension, mine, would collapse. He conditioned me to be his permanent safety net. If he forgot to pay a bill, it wasn't laziness, it was executive dysfunction. If he stayed out until 3 a.m., it wasn't a choice, it was a manic episode. He made me feel that to hold him accountable was to be ableist or unsympathetic to his struggles. This conditioning created a sunk cost fallacy of the heart. I had invested so much time into fixing him, so much money into stabilizing him, that the thought of walking away felt like admitting a total loss on a decade-long project. He knew this. He banked on it. He also conditioned our social circle, those dusty little circles at the country club and the local dive bars. Greg was a master of the reverse victim offender narrative. He would sit at the bar, nursing a scotch I paid for, and sigh to his friends about my demands. Elena is just... she's a lot, he'd tell them, shaking his head. She's so focused on the house, the lawn, the career. Everything has to be perfect. She doesn't understand that I'm just trying to survive the day. I feel like a guest in my own home. I'm just a prop in her perfect life. He was setting the stage. He was making sure that if things ever fell apart, he would be the tragic hero fleeing a cold, controlling wife, and I would be the high-strung villain who drove him to the edge. He wanted everyone to see my competence as a weapon, and his incompetence as a wound. At home, he practiced weaponized incompetence on the house itself. He'd try to mow the lawn, only to leave the mower in the middle of the yard, claiming the engine gave him anxiety. He'd look at a leaky faucet for 5 minutes before throwing his hands up, saying he felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of homeownership. He was forcing me to take over every masculine-coded task so he could later claim I stole his manhood. It was a brilliant, twisted bit of psychological engineering. By making me do everything, he gained the freedom to do nothing, and the right to complain about it. He thought he had trained me to be his servant. He thought he had conditioned me to be so afraid of his crises that I would never dare to look at the data. He wanted me to be a woman who was too busy saving him to ever realize she was the one being robbed. What he didn't realize is that actuaries are trained to look past the narrative and focus on the trend lines. And the trend line of Greg's struggles always led to the same place: my bank account. The conditioning was strong, but it wasn't permanent. It was like a fever that eventually breaks. And when mine finally broke, I didn't see a man in crisis. I saw a parasitic loss that needed to be written off. The breaking point arrived not with the discovery of a secret life, but with the total, shameless weaponization of his misery. It was a Thursday evening. I had just closed a $40 million reinsurance deal and was mentally exhausted. I walked into the kitchen to find Greg sitting in the dark, a bottle of expensive bourbon open on the counter. He didn't look up. He didn't ask about my day. He just stared at the wall in that practiced hollow gaze I had come to recognize as the preamble to a demand. "I can't do this anymore, Elena," he whispered. "The pressure of this life, this house, your expectations, it's suffocating. I've met someone who actually sees me, Someone who doesn't look at me like I'm a spreadsheet that needs to be balanced. He was talking about his newest receptionist distraction, a girl 20 years his junior who worked at the gym. But he wasn't confessing out of guilt. He was confessing to trigger a reaction. "I want you to file for divorce," he said, finally looking at me. There was a cruel, flickering light in his eyes. "I'm too fragile to handle the paperwork right now. My mental state is too precarious. If you care about me at all, you'll be the one to end this. You're the strong one, right? The one who handles everything? So handle this." I stood there, still holding my laptop bag, and I felt the final thread of my patience snap. I realized exactly what he was doing. If I filed for divorce, he could go to his dusty circles and play the victim. He could tell the world that his cold executive wife had discarded him in the middle of a mental health crisis. He wanted the house, the money, and the moral high ground. "You've been sleeping with her for months, haven't you?" I asked. My voice was eerily steady. "It doesn't matter," he snapped, standing up and towering over me. "I was driven to it. Your perfection is an act of violence, Elena. You make me feel like a failure every time you pay a bill or fix something I couldn't. I need to be with someone who lets me be a man." He then proceeded to spend the next hour escalating his verbal abuse. He called me a robotic ice queen, a financial warden, and a soul-sucking actuary. He paced the kitchen, knocking my decorative jars off the counter, waiting for me to cry, waiting for me to scream, waiting for me to give him the aggressive behavior he needed to justify his exit. I didn't give it to him. I stood perfectly still, watching him with the same detached curiosity I'd used to observe a bug in a jar. "Is that everything?" I asked when he finally ran out of breath. "You're a monster," he spat. "I'm moving out. I'm taking the SUV. Good luck with this beast of a house. I hope the roof falls in on you." He slammed the door so hard the glass rattled in the frames. I heard his tires screech on the driveway. The tires I had paid for 3 months ago. I didn't move for 10 minutes. I looked at the broken jars on the floor. I looked at the dark kitchen. And then I felt it. Peace. It wasn't the peace of a resolution. It was the peace of a battlefield when the enemy has finally revealed his position. He thought he had cornered me. He thought that by forcing me to file, he was securing his future. He forgot that by admitting the affair to force my hand, he had just handed me the keys to the infidelity clause. He wanted me to handle the divorce? Fine. I would handle it with the same robotic ice queen precision he hated so much. I didn't cry. I didn't call him. I walked upstairs, opened my laptop, and sent a one-line email to my attorney. "The trigger event has occurred. Activate the postnuptial protocol." The fragile man wanted a war. He was about to find out that you don't declare war on an actuary unless you've accounted for every possible loss. And Greg? He hadn't accounted for anything. In the world of risk assessment, we have a term called total loss absorption. It's the point where a system is so compromised that you stop trying to repair it and instead focus on salvaging the remaining assets before the collapse. As I sat in my home office the morning after Greg's departure, I wasn't mourning a marriage. I was conducting a salvage operation. Greg had spent 12 years underestimating me because I was quiet. He mistook my silence for submission, not realizing it was actually data collection. I opened the encrypted folder on my drive labeled Project Solvency. This wasn't just a divorce file. It was a forensic roadmap. I called my lead accountant, a woman named Diane who has the soul of a shark and the eyes of a hawk. Diane, I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. He's gone. He admitted to the affair with the gym receptionist. He's already bragging about it to his friends. I need the full audit of the shadow accounts and the final valuation of the infidelity clause assets. I've been waiting for this call, Elena, she replied. I've already pulled the subpoenaed records for his business credit cards. He's been a very busy man. We spent the next 6 hours in a high-stakes strategy session. Greg thought he was being clever by hiding money in his failed consulting firms. He didn't realize that as the primary guarantor on all those loans, I had legal access to every transaction. The forensic discovery was staggering. $42,000 funneled through consulting fees that were actually cash withdrawals at casinos. $12,000 in marketing expenses that matched the lease payments on a secret apartment he'd rented for his mistress 4 months ago. $6,500 in jewelry and designer bags purchased during business trips to New York. He thinks he's a victim, Diane noted, scrolling through a spreadsheet. But the data says he's a thief. This isn't just infidelity, Elena. This is dissipation of marital assets on a grand scale. We're not just looking at the 70% liquid asset split from the postnup. We're looking at a clawback of every cent he stole from the joint pool. Then we turn to the beast, the house. Greg assumed that because the air conditioner was dead and the fridge was leaking, the property was a liability. He thought I'd be forced to sell it at a loss, giving him a quick cash payout. He forgot who I work for. I deal with industrial-scale infrastructure. I didn't call a local handyman who would take 3 weeks to overcharge me. I called the commercial contractors my firm uses for high-rise maintenance. I didn't want a fix. I wanted a total system overhaul. I authorized $85,000 from my personal premarital emergency fund, money Greg never had access to replace the entire HVAC system with a dual-stage industrial unit and the kitchen with professional-grade appliances that would last 30 years. I wasn't fixing a house for a family. I was increasing the valuation of an asset I was about to own 100%. The final piece of the strategy was the victim narrative. Greg was currently at his local bar, spinning his dusty story about the cold, controlling wife who kicked him out in a crisis. I let him. In fact, I wanted him to keep talking. The more he talked, the more he admitted to the new life he was building with the receptionist, and the more evidence I had of his intent to abandon and his willful infidelity. I drafted a formal notice of termination of support. Since he had voluntarily moved out and admitted to a breach of the postnuptial agreement, I was legally allowed to freeze the secondary credit cards and the allowance account he used for his daily scotch and golf fees. He's going to panic, Diane warned. The moment that card declines at the bar, the mental health crisis is going to turn into a full-scale assault. Let him panic, I said. I've spent 12 years being his shock absorber. Now he's going to find out what happens when you hit the pavement without one. I closed my laptop and looked out at the lawn, the one he thought I was too delicate to mow. I didn't reach for a mower. I picked up the phone and hired a high-end landscaping crew to come twice a week, year-round. I instructed them to send the invoices directly to my attorney to be added to the maintenance of assets ledger for the divorce settlement. Greg wanted me to be a broken woman in a decaying house. Instead, I was becoming the CEO of a sovereign estate. The strategy was set. The beast was being tamed. And Greg? He was about to find out that when you play the victim in a game against an actuary, you've already lost the math. Execution is the silent part of the storm. While Greg was busy making noise at the local country club, I was orchestrating a surgical strike on our shared reality. The industrial upgrade began on Monday morning at 7 a.m. I didn't hire a local repairman with a rusted truck. I hired a specialized commercial mechanical crew. 3 white vans pulled into my driveway, and by noon, the beast of a house was swarming with professionals. They didn't just fix the air conditioner, they craned a 5-ton, high-efficiency SEER-21 industrial unit onto the side pad. They ripped out the leaking consumer-grade refrigerator and slid in a professional-grade Sub-Zero that looked like it belonged in a laboratory. As they worked, I sat at my mahogany desk, the one Greg always said made me look too corporate, and executed the financial severance. Monday, 10:15 a.m. I called the bank. I'd like to report the secondary cards on account ending in -4092 as at risk. Please freeze all spending immediately and transition the primary account to my sole name as per the standing power of attorney and the separation clause. Monday, 11:30 a.m. I contacted the landscaping corporation. I want the estate tier service. I want the trees trimmed, the mulch replaced with black slate, and the irrigation system completely digitized. Do not speak to anyone but me. If a man named Greg shows up and tells you to stop, call the police for trespassing. By Monday afternoon, the house was humming. The air was a crisp, clinical 68 degrees. The decay Greg had banked on was gone, replaced by the smell of new filters and expensive refrigerant. I felt like I was finally breathing oxygen instead of the recycled carbon dioxide of his excuses. Then came the charity phase of the execution. Greg had left the house with 2 suitcases, assuming he'd be back for the rest of his prizes. His $4,000 mountain bike, his collection of vintage watches, and the custom-tailored suits I'd bought him to play CEO in. He thought the house was his storage unit. He thought I was his warehouse manager. I walked into his walk-in closet. It was a monument to unearned luxury. I didn't feel anger as I looked at the $600 shoes and the cashmere sweaters. I felt the same detached efficiency I'd feel while clearing out a filing cabinet of obsolete data. I called a local high-end charity that supports men re-entering the workforce after incarceration or homelessness. I have a donation, I told the coordinator. Everything is designer, high quality, and lightly used. I need it gone today. I'll even pay for the hauling fee. By 4 p.m., Greg's entire physical presence had been purged from the estate. His CEO suits were being loaded into a donation truck. His anxiety mountain bike was being hauled away to a youth program. I replaced his clutter with empty, organized space. I didn't just remove his clothes. I removed the victim costume he wore. The final stroke of the execution was the legal delivery. I didn't send a text. I didn't make a call. I waited until 5 p.m., the exact time Greg usually ordered his second scotch at the club. I had a process server find him there, in front of his dusty little circle. He was served with 3 distinct sets of documents: the divorce petition, citing irreconcilable differences and admitted infidelity; the activation of the post-nuptial agreement, formally notifying him that his claim to the $1.2 million estate and the vacation property was now null and void; an immediate restraining order for civil harassment, preventing him from entering the property he had voluntarily abandoned 6 days prior. I was sitting on my back patio, watching the new irrigation system mist the lawn with surgical precision, when my phone finally began to scream. It was Greg. He had just tried to pay his bar tab, and for the first time in 12 years, the card had been declined. The victim had finally met the actuary. He left a voicemail, the first of 24. "Elena, what the hell is this? I'm at the club and my card is dead, and some guy just handed me papers? Is this a joke? You can't take the house. I have half of everything. You're hormonal. You're being crazy. Call me right now and fix this before I lose my mind. I didn't fix it. I listened to the message while sipping a glass of wine that cost more than his new apartment's weekly rent. I didn't feel pissed off. I didn't feel bitter. I felt the profound, silent satisfaction of a system that had finally been purged of its primary source of friction. The execution was complete. The house wasn't a beast anymore. It was a sanctuary. And the only thing decaying was Greg's belief that he could survive without the woman he called delicate. Panic is the sound of a parasite realizing the host has developed an immune system. For Greg, the panic didn't set in when he read the legal papers. It set in when he realized that the delicate woman he'd left behind had effectively deleted his existence from the physical world. Tuesday, 8:15 a.m. Greg showed up at the front gate. I watched him on the 4K security feed from the comfort of my climate-controlled office. He looked disheveled, wearing the same shirt he'd been served in at the bar. He tried his key. It didn't turn. He tried the biometric keypad. It didn't beep. He began to pound on the solid oak door, his face turning a shade of purple that matched his mounting desperation. "Elena! Open the door! You can't do this! My stuff is in there! My bike is in there! You're stealing my life!" I didn't open the door. I pressed the intercom button. "Greg, you were served with a restraining order yesterday. You are currently trespassing. If you don't leave the premises in 60 seconds, the security company will dispatch local law enforcement. As for your stuff, I suggest you check your email. You've been sent a tax-deductible receipt for a very generous donation to the local men's shelter." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, the explosion. He didn't sound like a tortured soul anymore. He sounded like a man who had lost his meal ticket. He screamed at the doorbell camera, a frantic, high-pitched list of demands. He threatened to sue. He threatened to tell the truth to everyone we knew. He claimed his mental health was in a tailspin and that I would be responsible for whatever happened to him. "I have nowhere to go, Elena. I'm in a studio apartment with a hot plate. You're living in a palace I helped build." "You didn't build it, Greg," I said, my voice coming through the speaker with the clarity of a mountain spring. "You just lived in it while I paid for it. And the palace is currently at peak efficiency. The air conditioner is fixed, the lawn is being mowed. The only thing missing is the weight of your excuses." I watched him slump against the door. The dusty circles he'd been performing for were nowhere to be found. His friends at the bar didn't want a roommate with no credit card and a looming divorce. His mistress, the gym receptionist, had reportedly gone silent the moment his secondary accounts were frozen. He stayed on the porch for 10 minutes, sobbing, not out of grief, but out of the sheer, terrifying realization that he was now responsible for himself. He was a man who had spent 12 years playing at being a CEO and a victim, only to find out that without my sponsorship, he was just a middle-aged man with no assets and a mounting legal debt. When the patrol car finally pulled into the driveway, he didn't fight. He looked at the officers with a pathetic, pleading expression, trying to launch into his mental health monologue. They didn't listen. They escorted him to his SUV, the one I'd already filed a notice of intent to repossess on, and watched him drive away. The panic was over. The silence returned. I went back to my spreadsheet. The Greg line item had officially been moved to the disposed column. The final legal showdown didn't take place in a courtroom. It took place in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at my attorney's firm. Greg arrived 40 minutes late, a tactical move designed to make me feel anxious. Instead, I used the time to finish a quarterly risk report for my firm. By the time he walked in, I was the one who was settled, and he was the one who was frantic. He looked smaller. The CEO swagger had been replaced by the twitchy energy of a man who was discovering that life in a studio apartment with a hot plate is significantly less artistic than he had imagined. He sat down across from me, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he'd been hired from a late-night television ad, the only person Greg could afford now that his allowance had been cut off. "Elena," Greg began, leaning forward and attempting to project his old, tortured charisma. "Let's be adults here. You've had your fun. You've upgraded the house, you've donated my clothes to a shelter, which, by the way, my lawyer says is theft, and you've locked me out of my own life. But you can't ignore the law. 12 years of marriage. I'm entitled to 50% of that estate, and 50% of the liquid assets. I built that life with you." I didn't speak. I simply slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the table toward his attorney. "In that folder," I said, my voice cutting through his performance like a scalpel, "is the postnuptial agreement you signed in year 5. You'll find the infidelity clause highlighted on page 12. You'll also find the metadata-stamped text messages, hotel receipts, and the sworn affidavit from the receptionist you've been mentoring for the last 4 months." Greg's lawyer opened the folder. As he read, the color began to drain from his face. Greg, however, didn't stop. "That agreement was signed under duress," Greg shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "I was in a mental health crisis. I didn't know what I was signing. Any judge will see that you manipulated a man in a vulnerable state." "Actually, Greg," I replied, leaning back and interlacing my fingers, "the agreement was signed in the presence of a third-party notary and your then attorney. We also have the psychiatric evaluation you insisted on having that same month to prove your fitness for a business loan. You can't be too depressed to be held accountable for an affair, but stable enough to manage a 6-figure startup fund. The data doesn't support both narratives." I watched his attorney lean over and whisper something in his ear. Greg's eyes widened. He pushed his chair back, the screech of metal on the tile floor sounding like a dying animal. "You're really doing this? You're going to use a piece of paper to take away everything I worked for?" "You didn't work for it, Greg. You spent it," I said. "And as for the theft of your belongings, my attorney has already filed the abandonment and storage offset motion. Since you left the property voluntarily and refused to pay for the maintenance of the estate, the broken AC, the leaking fridge, the landscaping, I simply liquidated the abandoned property to cover the costs of the industrial upgrades you forced me to make. The donation receipt is in your name. You're welcome for the tax break." The room went silent. I saw Greg's facade finally crumble. The dusty circle hero was gone. In his place was a man who realized that he was staring at a 70-30 split of the liquid assets, minus the clawbacks for the marital funds he'd spent on his mistress. "I have nothing," he whispered, the bravado finally gone. "I'm living in a dump. I don't even have a suit for an interview." "You have exactly what you brought into this marriage, Greg," I said, standing up. "Your soul and your freedom. You told me you wanted to be with someone who didn't look at you like a spreadsheet. Well, you got your wish. I've balanced the books. You're no longer a deficit in my life." His lawyer tried to argue, but the math was absolute. The infidelity clause wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a legal firewall I had built years ago, knowing that a man like Greg would eventually try to burn the house down just to see the flames. "One more thing," I said as I reached the door. "The SUV? The repossession order was executed an hour ago. I suggest you call a rideshare, though with your current credit score, you might want to check the bus schedule." I walked out of the room without looking back. I didn't feel the need to see his final collapse. In my world, once the risk has been mitigated and the loss has been absorbed, the file is closed. He had spent 12 years trying to convince me I was delicate, so he could keep me in the dark. He never realized that the delicate woman was the one who had built the cage he was now trapped in. He thought he was playing a game of emotions. I was playing a game of assets. As I walked out into the sun, I didn't feel pissed off. I felt the profound, surgical peace of a woman who had finally paved over the rot and was ready to build something new on top of it. 6 months have passed since the project's solvency file was officially closed. I am currently sitting on my back patio, the one Greg once claimed was too high maintenance for a woman like me to enjoy. The air is a perfect, filtered 68 degrees inside the house, and the lawn is a deep, architectural green, maintained by a crew that arrives with the regularity of a Swiss watch. The beast isn't a beast anymore. It's a finely tuned machine, hummed into submission by industrial-grade engineering and a total absence of chaos. Greg is currently residing in a 400-square-foot studio apartment on the industrial side of town. The gym receptionist left him 3 weeks after the car was repossessed and the secondary credit cards were frozen. It turns out that a tortured soul is much less attractive when it doesn't come with a 4-car garage and a premium wine cellar. He recently took a job as a customer service representative for a mid-level tech firm. It's the kind of entry-level position he would have considered beneath his dignity a year ago. Now, it's the only thing keeping his hot plate running. I didn't just walk away with the house. I walked away with the peace of mind that comes from a perfectly balanced ledger. Because I triggered the infidelity clause, the final settlement was a slaughter. I retained 100% of the equity in our primary estate and the vacation property. After the forensic accountants finished clawing back the $80,000 he had dissipated on his mistress and his gambling benders, Greg's 30% of the liquid assets shrank to a figure that barely covers his legal fees and a year's rent. My dusty circles have also been purged. The friends who listened to his victim narrative and looked at me with pity, they were removed along with the broken appliances. I replaced them with a community of high net worth professionals who value transparency over performance. Sometimes I'll get a restricted call at 2 a.m., the classic calling card of a man who has had too much cheap bourbon and too much time to think. I don't answer. I don't even check the transcript. I've blocked his number, his email, and his presence from my psyche with the same clinical efficiency I used to block his access to my bank account. I am not a broken woman living in a decaying house. I am a sovereign individual living in an upgraded fortress. Greg thought that by leaving, he was taking the life of the house with him. He didn't realize that he wasn't the life. He was the leak. Now that the leak has been patched, the pressure is stable, the systems are running at 100%, and for the first time in 12 years, the only thing fragile in this estate is the fine crystal I use to toast to my own freedom. In my profession, we have a saying, numbers don't lie, but people do. For 12 years, I allowed myself to be gaslit by a man who used his struggles as a smokescreen for his selfishness. I mistook my endurance for love, and my silence for strength. But the greatest lesson I learned is that patience is only a virtue when it is being invested in something that can actually grow. When you spend your life saving someone who is actively drilling holes in the boat, you aren't a hero. You're just a co-pilot on a sinking ship. Greg wanted me to believe that I was the problem because I was too much. Too capable, too logical, too successful. He wanted to frame my independence as a weapon because it highlighted his own inadequacy. But once I stopped looking at him through the lens of a wife and started looking at him through the lens of an auditor, the truth was undeniable. He was a liability I could no longer afford to carry. If you are currently carrying the weight of someone else's choices, remember this: you are allowed to stop. You are allowed to be robotic and cold when the person you love is using your warmth to burn you down. If you've ever had to stop being a justifier and start being an executor, hit that like button and share this story. Let me know in the comments, what was the moment you realized your patience had officially run out? And don't forget to subscribe. We're building a community of people who value the truth over the performance. I'm Elena. I'm an actuary, a homeowner, and a survivor of a 12-year deficit. The beast is tamed, the audit is over, and I am finally, surgically, at peace.